السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of the Gems of the Heart, where we look into our hearts. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts, this amazing part of our body that matters of al-Iman, matters of purity. To enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is according how our hearts are pure. This is something that is the duty of this life, something that is very serious, and as has been mentioned many times before, many people, they don't give attention to their hearts. They're more occupied with their physical appearance, with their speech and actions. If they are good people, they're more focused on what they say and what they do physically, and many times they would ignore what's in their hearts. The heart is the foundation of all goodness and the foundation of all evil also. So unless we pay attention to what's in our hearts, the matters of al-Iman, the matters of al-Islam, manners, matters of worship, the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala done by our hearts and so on. It's a duty, something that constantly, every day we need to work on our hearts, to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from what pollutes and contaminate our hearts. And there's nothing more important and more purifying to our hearts than the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran. This is the thing that will purify our hearts. But if we really understand the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and give it its time and its rights, and to reflect upon it, to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, and the physical actions has a great effect. Because when a sin is committed, that pollutes the heart immediately. As the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that clearly in the authentic hadith reported by more than one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and that the sins تعرض الذنوب على أو تعرض الفتن على القلوب. The fitan, the tribulations, are being presented to the hearts كالحصير, like the straw mat, and so on. So this is something that everything is being presented into our hearts. What we see, what we hear, what we indulge ourselves in, this is something that is very serious, and therefore we should protect our eyes from seeing what is evil. We should protect our ears from hearing what is evil. We should protect our hearts by immersing this heart in what is good, in what is beautiful, and not to be forgetful about the purpose of our life. And we have been talking about the names and attributes of Allah, as part of talking about the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as part of talking about the matters of aqeedah, matters of belief. That is the foundation for any purification of our souls and our hearts. And the subject of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been for many other episodes, because this is such an important subject. And how can we purify our hearts by the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The most important thing, of course, and how these names and attributes are mentioned in the Quran, and how it should affect our hearts and actions and so on. One of these things that are mentioned in the Quran, in some interesting verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned something about being أحكم الحاكمين. أحكم الحاكمين means the most just of all judges. We all know Surah At-Tin. Most of us, we have Surah At-Tin memorized, young and old. والتين والزيتون وطور سينين وهذا البلد الأمين لقد خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم ثم رددناه أسفل سافلين إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات فلهم أجر غير ممنون فما يكذبك بعد بالدين أليس الله بأحكم الحاكمين. The surah ends with أليس الله بأحكم الحاكمين. Isn't that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges? It's a question that the answer of it is a very obvious one. It's a question not to question the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather to bring from the hearts of the believers, from those who listen to the book of Allah, that they would say, Bala, they would say, yes, indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges. By the question, it brings from oneself the answer. That means the person is by necessity believing in what has been mentioned. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is أحكم الحاكمين, the most just of all judges. This is a very interesting subject, and we'll see some of the verses in the Quran that talks about this. Sometimes it mentions أحكم الحاكمين. Sometimes the verses will talk about خير الحاكمين, the best of all judges. The subject here is Al-Hakimin, comes from Al-Hakam. One of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam, the most just, the one that is the judge, the one that rules and judge among His people, because He's the most just subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the life that we live in, people, they have to go to certain terms or certain judgment to deal with their disputes. Human beings, as human beings, they have different opinions, different ways, different disputes. And no matter what country a person lives in, you would find there's a judgment system, a justice system that has been established for people to refer to when it comes to their disputes. There are judges all over the world. And the job of the judge is to bring the disputes to justice, because injustice is such an evil thing. And no matter, again, where the person lives on the face of earth, every single human being, they understand very well what it means to be treated with injustice. Injustice is an evil thing, and nobody likes to be treated with injustice. All human beings, in principle, even the most unjust person, in principle, he would say, I love justice. Justice is a beautiful thing. Right? Justice is something that is engraved in our innate, that we love what is just and we hate injustice, in principle. But then why people do injustices? For many other reasons. Once they have the power and they have the means, when they see that there is no repercussions or outcome of their injustices, the greed of the human beings lead them astray, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, as human beings, in principle, justice is a beautiful thing and injustice is an evil thing. So the judge is a respected individual because he brings justice. At least in principle, people would love matter of justice to be prevailing and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the judge. He's the creator of all things. He's the one that created the human beings and created what they believe in or what they love or what they don't love. He's the creator of justice itself and what's injustice and so on and so forth. So the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of it whatsoever. No matter how much people are just and love justice, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. And nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we know also, we can relate to this, whenever the judge would give a ruling, everybody respect. And everybody would follow the rules of the judge. Especially if he's someone that is well respected, backed by the laws of the land and so on and so forth. Especially if there's some supreme judges or supreme courts or whatever, in whatever system, people would go maybe from one step to the other. Maybe they might dispute some judges or some of their rulings, and they go to higher courts and higher courts till they reach a level where there's nothing beyond this. And once the ruling is being established, it becomes a constitution or becomes a rule and a law for the people, and they would even take from these rulings as an analogy for other rulings. And this is something that is well known throughout the world. And human beings, they understand that very well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all judges, because He's the creator of all of them. He's the one that created them. And He's the one that created in them the intellect to know what is just and what is unjust. And therefore, see how human beings, they respect and they follow the rulings done by the judges and the supreme judges and so on. Therefore, the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be treated even more stronger. So the believers, they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all judges. So what is the outcome of this? They submit themselves to the rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in our disputes, and this is what we as Muslims should hold fast to. We should look into ourselves as Muslims ummah today. What do we do with our disputes? Even in disputes that talks about or mentions opinions, people are talking about different matters and debating many things. How do we bring our disputes to be resolved? Are we referring matters to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or we're stuck into our desires and our opinions and our likings and so on? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is khayrul hakimin, He is ahkamul hakimin, the best of all judges, the most just of all judges. So therefore, as a result of believing in this, we have to refer the matter to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give the ruling that intoxications is haram, this is forbidden for you to intoxicate yourself. This is the ruling, this is the verdict is done. Is there still room to negotiate or the debate whether it's benefiting or not, whether it's good for our economy or not, people would like us or not? All of these things are desires. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave a ruling, then the believers should submit themselves to the rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the ruling that there are specific times where you need to go to the salah and make salah, you need to go to the masjid to make the salah. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called the believers, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا نُودِيَ لِلصَّلَاةِ مِنْ يَوْمِ الْجُمُعَةِ فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَذَرُوا الْبَيْعَ. O you who believe, if the call in the day of Jumu'ah is called, then go to the dhikr, to the remembrance of Allah, and leave trade and all of what you're busy with. This is a ruling. This is the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Would someone then after that disputes, but my job, my work, my business, my money, all of that is opposing what? Opposing the verdict, the justice of the most just of all judges, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the effect of it. And we can go on with this in so many different things in our life. But let's first look into some of these verses that talks about these specific meaning here, أحكم الحاكمين or خير الحاكمين. If we take it in the chronological order of the Quran, in Surah Al-A'raf, for example, Surah Al-A'raf, in the verses that talks about the people of Madian and the Prophet Shu'aib. And Prophet Shu'aib, he has been called Khatibul Anbiya, the prophet that is basically a well-spoken one, someone that was very intellectual in his speech, very strong in his speech and his arguments and so on. He said to his people in the verse in Surah Al-A'raf, verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relate to us in the surah, verse number 70 or 87. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Shu'aib, وَإِن كَانَ طَائِفَةٌ مِّنكُمْ آمَنُوا بِالَّذِي أُرْسِلْتُ بِهِ وَطَائِفَةٌ لَمْ يُؤْمِنُوا فَاصْبِرُوا حَتَّى يَحْكُمَ اللَّهُ بَيْنَنَا وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْحَاكِمِينَ. When he debated with them, and they said things to him, and he called them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they refuted or they tried to oppose the truth and so on, going back and forth, at the end what did he say to his people? That if group among you believed in what I have been sent with, and group of you, they did not believe, فَاصْبِرُوا, then be patient, till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, حَتَّى يَحْكُمَ اللَّهُ بَيْنَنَا, till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judge between us. وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْحَاكِمِينَ, He is the best of all judges. That means the ruling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will go through. And what happened afterwards? The people were destroyed, the disbelievers, and the verdict, the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to save Shu'aib alayhi salam, to save the believers with him, and to destroy the disbelievers. That's the judgment of Allah. That is based on the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after the matter has been made very clear to them. But see how content and how settled the heart of Shu'aib alayhi salam, that he had tried to convince them. He called them. He had the patience to invite them. One verse after another talking about this. And you can go back and refer to this in Surah Al-A'raf to see that. But when they were arrogant, they were stubborn, they get to know the truth and they opposed it for their own desires. Then he said, and he referred the matter to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we will wait for the judgment of Allah. And He's the best of all judges subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came afterwards. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is khayrul hakimin, the best of all judges. So no matter what judgment that you might hear of, no matter how, whatever good that you might hear, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. And He is subhanahu wa ta'ala the best of all judges. In Surah Hud, we would see that in verse number 45. Verse number 45 in Surah Hud, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned أحكم الحاكمين, the best of all judges, the most just. Now here أحكم الحاكمين is the most just of all judges, the most just of all judges. He said in the story of Nuh alayhi salam, he called his people. And pay attention that this is from the prophets of Allah. We take them as examples and how to deal with their people. ونادى نوح ربه فقال رب إن ابني من أهلي وإن وعدك الحق وأنت أحكم الحاكمين. When Nuh alayhi salam in Surah Hud, his story is mentioned in the most extensive way, so much details, and how his people have been drowned after calling them for close to 1,000 years, calling them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the dialogue between Nuh and his son, to the last moment, he's calling his son, Ya Bunay, O my son, reminding him of this strong relationship that he is his father, he cares for him, and calling his son to be with them, to be on the ship, because everyone else will be destroyed, because it has been revealed to Nuh alayhi salam. Only the believers will be saved, and that's the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after the matter has been made clear to the people. And the son of Nuh refused, and he was a disbeliever, and he drowned with those who drowned. So afterwards, Nuh alayhi salam, he invoked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying, Inna bini min ahli, that my son is from my people, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised Nuh alayhi salam that he would save his people. وَإِنَّ وَعْدَكَ الْحَقِّ, and indeed your promise is the truth. وَأَنْتَ أَحْكَمُ الْحَاكِمِينَ, and you are the most just of all judges. So he's making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges. And he's referring this to matters of punishment, not to matters of mercy or forgiveness. Why? Because when the subject is justice, then the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned, because that's by the justice of Allah. But when it comes to the mercy of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. If a person asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to treat him with justice, all of us will be destroyed. Imagine, in each and every one of us, we know ourselves very well. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala treat us with His justice, what happens? We're all sinners. We all committed sins. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish all of us if He treats us with His justice only, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we are in need of the forgiveness from Allah. We are in need of the mercy of Allah, so that we are forgiven. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forgive us, and He has the right not to forgive, He is the owner of all things, that means we will be punished, and that's why we are in need of the mercy of Allah. When we go for Hajj, when we make our salah, the day of Arafah, the day where the shaitan is never seen to be as small and humiliated as he is seen in the day of Arafah. Why? Because of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He sees, the forgiveness of the sins that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive His slaves. Why? Because the justice of Allah means, when the justice is being served, that means there's punishment. So Nuh alayhi salam, when he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his son, that he is the most just of all judges, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replied to Nuh alayhi salam, as it's mentioned in the next verse, قال يا نوح إنه ليس من أهلك إنه عمل غير صالح فلا تسألني ما ليس لك به علم إني أعظك أن تكون من الجاهلين, saying that basically he is not from your family, he is not from your people, because he is someone that is not righteous, and that's the justice of Allah. He chose to die in the state of disbelief, and so on. So this is basically how Nuh alayhi salam, he used the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-Hakam, and saying Ahkam al-Hakimin in his dua, and using this in the dua of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is basically how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that. Also in Surah Yunus, towards the end of Surah Yunus, this has been mentioned there, which is Khairul Hakimin, the best of all judges. And really it's interesting, and that's why we need to, when we read the Quran, we need to go to verses and search and read and reflect and ask to benefit. To benefit by the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how the orders of the verses are, and to look at the context of things, so that we can benefit from the verses of the Quran. The last verse in Surah Yunus. And if we want to really understand it, go back few verses when it talks about the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for people to hold fast to the truth. And it starts from verse number 104, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calling the people and ordering the Prophet ﷺ to call the people not to be doubt, and if they do, then to say clearly to them that I worship the one that created me. I do not worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I worship the one that make you die. He's the most powerful. Nobody owns this except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. So at the last verse of Surah Yunus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاتَّبِعْ مَا يُوحَى إِلَيْكَ وَاصْبِرْ حَتَّى يَحْكُمَ اللَّهُ وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْحَاكِمِينَ. The order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after stating the facts and after the truth has been made clear to the people, and guidance from misguidance has been made very clear, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, saying, وَاتَّبِعْ مَا يُوحَى إِلَيْكَ. That means, follow what has been revealed to you. وَاتَّبِعْ مَا يُوحَى إِلَيْكَ. Follow, وَاتَّبِعْ مَا يُوحَى إِلَيْكَ, what has been revealed to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَاصْبِرْ, and be patient, حَتَّى يَحْكُمَ اللَّهِ, till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judge, as we heard it in Surah Al-A'raf. Till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judge among the people, وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْحَاكِمِينَ, and He's the best of all judges. So that means, if you see that disbelievers are opposing you, if you see that disbelievers are being spreading corruption on the face of earth, and they are superior, temporarily, and they are humiliating the believers and so on, and the believers are weak and oppressed, and they don't have the physical means and so on, your job is to follow the truth. Don't compromise your religion. Don't make the power of the disbelievers and their ways and their plots and so on take you away from your mission on the face of earth. Make you compromise anything of the truth. Hold fast to it and follow what has been revealed to you, and be patient till the ruling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come, and it will come. He will give you victory. He will make you victorious. And if you don't see that in your life, the moment of death for you is the moment of victory. You will be victorious when you die steadfast on the deen of Allah. Why? Because you would receive the glad tidings, and the matter will be made very clear then. And at the same time, the disbelievers, the tyrants, the evil, those who spread corruption and so on, the moment of death for them is the moment of defeat, even though they are defeated before that. Why? Because they would return to the everlasting misery and punishment by the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is basically the ways of the believers, because they believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the most just of all judges, the best of all judges. So the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are two types of rulings, and these verses are basically explaining that to us. And we need to pay attention really, because that's a very serious and a very important subject. There are two types of rulings from Allah. There is the universal one, and there is the religious one. The religious one is basically what's haram, what's halal. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ruled for us. The judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for us to do this, for us to stay away from this, to be holding fast to the deen of Allah. This is the hukm, the ruling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with matters of religion. And there is the universal verdict and judgment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is, the victory will be for the believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will defeat the disbelievers, and so on. This is something that is inevitable, something that has to happen. But it doesn't have to happen in your lifetime. So therefore be patient. Fulfill the first type of judgment, which is the religious one. If you fulfill that, if you are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His rulings, He gave orders, He gave rulings, He gives verdict. This is permissible, this is not permissible. Do this, do not do that, and so on. If you are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this, then you would receive the universal ruling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but be patient, because it's coming. And if people have the patience and steadfast and continue to be steadfast, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring His justice, because injustice would never prevail, would never continue to be the case. Whatever injustices that is present on the face of earth, it's only temporary. Don't be deceived by it. Don't think that this will stay forever. It's only for a short period of time. Short period of time, why? So that those who are unjust will continue to immerse themselves in injustice, so that when the punishment of Allah comes, nobody would say, maybe they can be given another chance, or maybe this is not enough time for them. No, the matter has been made very clear, and they continue to be on the matter of injustices, so that when the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes, no excuse. Like a person, for example, steals. Many people, they never caught in the first time. They're given time. And then one time after the other, and instead of them repenting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they continue. The same thing when it comes to sins. A person might fall into a sin. Nobody's seen him. Nobody knows anything about it except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a person should be grateful to Allah that he's not been exposed to others. And therefore a person should repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if a person deceives himself, and he's deceived by this, so he will continue to commit sins, then what happens? He might be exposed later, after he's been given many chances. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us benefit. We'll come back inshallah ta'ala after the break with the same verse in Surah Yunus and more verses that talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the best of all judges and being the most just of all judges. So stay with us inshallah, and with your phone calls and your comments, stay with us till we be back. We'll be right back inshallah. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. Welcome back. And we're talking about two different things that are mentioned in the Quran that basically refers to the same meaning, which is Ahkamul Hakimeen and Khayrul Hakimeen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most just of all judges and the best of all judges. We talked about that and how that it refers to the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hakam, the judge, and how that should affect our life, matters of belief, matters of our actions, and how that would increase our submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Something that the prophets of Allah, they've mentioned in their dua, in invoking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by being patient with what the disbelievers are doing to them, doing to the best people ever, the messengers of Allah, and having the patience till the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like the human beings. Human beings are different. They are creation of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of Him. Many people, they might, wal'iyadhu billah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from that, they suggest maybe things on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do. Like a person would say, why the victory of Allah is not coming to the believers nowadays? Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges. Anything that happens in the dominion of the heavens and the earth, it happens under the power of Allah, the knowledge of Allah, and the justice of Allah. Why there's injustices are being left to be committed on the face of earth, and that's actually one of the things that many of the evildoers or even atheists, they might express these types of doubts. Why would many injustice be left to be done by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the universal permission? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not the like of the human beings. The justice of Allah will be served perfectly, no doubt whatsoever. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives time because He's the most wise. And that's why the word Al-Hakam and Al-Hakim are related. And that's why Al-Hakam means the judge and Al-Hakim being the wise, the most wise. The judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like the human beings, but it's based on perfect wisdom. Perfect wisdom that is related to perfect knowledge, that is beyond our realm of knowledge whatsoever. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. His justice is nothing is the like of it whatsoever. That's why the prophets of Allah, when they reach a time or a state where they can't do anything physically against the disbelievers and the ways of the disbelievers, they would say, we are going to be patient, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the judge and the most just of all judges. And that our job is to follow, وَاتَّبِعْ مَا يُوحَى إِلَيْكَ, that follow what has been revealed to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَاصْبِرْ حَتَّى يَحْكُمَ اللَّهِ, and be patient till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings His verdict and His judgment, because indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all judges. So this has a great effect in our life. And to be patient and to have the good expectations of Allah. Nothing will escape the justice of Allah. But again, as we said, for the hujjah and the evidences to be established against the disbelievers, because they won't have any excuse whatsoever, and for the believers to be elevated in levels and so on. So great wisdoms, whether we know it or whether we don't know it. But this is something that the believers, they also always refer to. There are two more positions where in the Quran mentioned Khayrul Hakimeen and Ahkamul Hakimeen. In Surah Yusuf alayhi salam, he mentioned this to his brothers, when, you know, the story of Yusuf alayhi salam and how the brothers of Yusuf alayhi salam came at the end, and the matter has been established in the right way by the justice of Allah. And the brothers of Yusuf, they mentioned this, in which they wanted to make the matter to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in Surah Yusuf. But really, the end of one of the verses, which is verse number 79, when one of the brothers of Yusuf, he said, فَلَنْ أَبْرَحَ الْأَرْضَ حَتَّى يَأْذَنَ لِي أَبِي أَوْ يَحْكُمَ اللَّهُ لِي وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْحَاكِمِينَ. That when the father of Yusuf, he took the covenant from the brothers of Yusuf, that they would not basically ruin their brother and so on, after they were going to Yusuf alayhi salam. So when the matter was made clear and the brother of Yusuf was kept with him, so the older brother, he said he's not going to go back unless his father give the permission for him, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring his judgment. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all judges whatsoever. So it's something that shows also the submission of Allah, to wait for the judgment of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. You know, when someone is faced with something that is beyond one's capacity, something that you cannot do anything about, someone that has been treated with injustice, someone that will be accused of something that he didn't do. How many people are accused of things where they are innocent of? What can they do? They have no power whatsoever to prove that they're innocent, and they're being given an image that it's not them. This is where a person would refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all judges. The matter is not going to be left like this. Don't worry. You are innocent, your innocence will be clear and open and will be publicly made. It doesn't have to be in this life. But what rather is important is the everlasting goodness of it. The day of judgment, this is where everything will be exposed. What is wrong with having things that are not very clear in this life? It doesn't matter. Why? Because there's the hereafter. There's the day of judgment. The day of judgment. Who's the owner of the day of judgment? Maliki yawmiddin. We say that in Surah Al-Fatiha all the time. He's the owner of the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be served in the most perfect way. No injustice whatsoever will prevail. Nobody will escape the justice of Allah. So therefore, either people will see the mercy of Allah and the forgiveness of Allah, or the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why, again, as we said in Surah At-Teen, which is a very important place for us, that we know this verse in Surah At-Teen, أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَحْكَمِ الْحَاكِمِينَ. Isn't that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, of course He is. So therefore, when we look into this, in Surah At-Teen, it shows the value of the human beings. One of the principles or the goals of Surah At-Teen is to show the value of the human beings. And that the value of the human beings is according to how that human being is holding fast to the deen of Allah, to the value of his life. And he can ruin himself and go to the lowest level by turning away from the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the end of Surah At-Teen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَحْكَمِ الْحَاكِمِينَ. That isn't it indeed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges? And how is that? In this world, by the rulings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to the believers, and also when it comes to the day of judgment. He made it a day of recompense. That people, would it make sense whatsoever that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leave His creation like this? How can a person believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges, and then he would believe that this world is left like this for people to do whatever they want to do, for those who are unjust to continue to do injustice, and to humiliate those who are weak and oppressed? That's against the fact that there's a creator of the heavens and the earth. The creator of the heavens and the earth, He has to be the most just. And He's the best of all judges. And He's the most just of all judges. And therefore, everything will be brought back to the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why, as the previous verse, before this verse in Surah At-Teen, فَمَا يُكَذِّبُكَ بَعْدُ بِالدِّينِ أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَحْكَمِ الْحَاكِمِينَ. That what is meant by this verse is فَمَا يُكَذِّبُكَ بَعْدُ بِالدِّينِ. What make you, O human being, then deny the day of resurrection? If we go back, because Surah At-Teen, we all know Surah At-Teen very well. So see how the surah started with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swearing with At-Teen. At-Teen is the figs or so, and the zaytun and the olives. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is swearing that, which is the place of in Palestine where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Isa alayhi salam, وَطُورِ سِنِينَ, referring to the message of Musa alayhi salam, وَهَذَا الْبَلَدِ الْأَمِينَ, and this secure town which is Mecca, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed the favor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, being from the people of Mecca the best place on earth. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after swearing by these three blessed and beautiful places, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. Indeed, we created the human beings in the best image whatsoever, the best way and form, that would basically make him fulfill the purpose of his life. ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ. Then we brought him down to the lowest level, whether it's physically a person being young and strong and so on, and then grow old to be weak and deficient and so on, or the same thing when it comes to sins and so on, disbelief. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ فَلَهُمْ أَجْرٌ غَيْرُ مَمْنُونَ. Except for those who believe and do righteous good deeds, they have a reward that is never terminated. Why? Because they will be in the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَمَا يُكَذِّبُكَ بَعْدُ بِالدِّينِ, which basically means, what is that thing that would make you, O human being, deny the day of judgment? What would make you deny the day of recompense after you see the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with all have been mentioned? أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَحْكَمِ الْحَاكِمِينَ. Isn't that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most judge of all judges? How can then He not have the day of judgment, where the disbelievers, where the wrongdoers, where the just ones would not be brought to the justice of Allah? How can that be when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just and He's the creator of the heavens and earth? When we heard first about the surah, it gives the value of the human being. Really, the value of the human beings, as Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, that's a great benefit for us to pay attention to. That he said, قِيمَةُ كُلُّ امْرِئٍ مَا يُحْسِنُ, which means the value of every human being is what he is good at. And that's a very powerful advice that he radiallahu anhu, they say it was referred to him, that means a statement. That means your value, because the surah talks about the value of the human beings, whether to be in the highest level or to be in the lowest one. Your value is according to what you are good at. So if a person is good at injustice, is good at spreading corruption on the face of earth, is good at deceiving people, spreading sins, spreading haram everywhere, manufacturing things that would intoxicate the people, selling drugs, exposing one's awrah, deceiving people with movies and songs and things of that nature, making people forgetful, making people follow the ways of shaitan, devil. This is what he's good at. That's his value. His value is according to what he's good at. No value whatsoever. Bad value. But the good value for the people, and that's what we need to think about, is what is that thing that we are good at? Are we good at the good things? Are we working on ourselves to know the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is going to be our value. So therefore, we should elevate ourselves. And elevating ourselves, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just of all judges. Corruption, injustice, all of these things would never be left like this without being returned back to the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a beautiful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hakam. It's a beautiful way of life if we have the reality of it in our hearts. Would make things clear to us. Many of Muslims today even, they are, if it's correct to say, depressed, or they don't understand why things are happening, or why they are in that state or this state or whatever. And many of them, they don't know the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. We need to learn. We need to have the knowledge of the deen of Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to understand. And once we understand the reality of things, then we will have the patience. Never have the bad expectations of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all judges. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. Whatever things are being left to be in the state of injustice by the actions of the human beings, be patient till the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be there, and it's going to be there. But be patient, and not to do things that is opposing to the deen of Allah. Many even people, they might go astray into matter of extremism when they see so much injustices. And they would take the injustice as an evidence for them to revolt, or to be extremist, or to do things that is not permissible in the deen of Islam, killing, exploding, suicide attacks, whatever there is. This verse should be something that they should understand. وَاصْبِرْ حَتَّى يَحْكُمَ اللَّهُ. Be patient till the verdict, till the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes, and He is the best of all judges. He's the most just. Injustice would never continue to be forever. Your job is to وَاتَّبِعْ. Follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered you to do. Follow that. Be patient, and be patient till the ruling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes. But to take matters in our hands in a foolish way, opposing the orders of Allah, committing injustices and spreading corruption and so on, This is something that would bring the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us. And therefore we have to be patient with the orders of Allah. It's beautiful meanings. It makes the person understand exactly how things are on the face of earth. It makes the person not really paying attention to what people are doing, but rather a person would see the power of Allah and the ways of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth, and to see what's going to happen in the Day of Judgment, and how much regret people would have in the Day of Judgment as a result of their injustices that they did not repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from. These people, for example, they might live for 80 years, 70 years, committing injustices and atrocities and killing and so on. But then where they are going to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are they going to escape the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? They are not going to escape the judgment of Allah. Everybody shall return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's just a matter of time. And that's why a person should be patient with the orders of Allah. And on the individual level, we need to be patient with the orders of Allah, knowing the reality of this life. This life is not meant for it to be the everlasting joy. If you have a family, if you have a wife, children, as you see, the reality of this life is not always something that you enjoy so much as far as the physical aspect of this life. Many people, they are depressed and sad in this life because they have been convinced wrongfully that their job in this life is to have fun. And once they don't have fun, then they fall into depression. Who said that life is about fun? Life is not about having fun. Life is about fulfilling the purpose of this life. One day you're sad, one day you're happy. One day you're bored, one day you're not bored. One day a person is sick, another day is healthy. This is how life is. People, they are healthy, they die, they get old, they get weak and strong, and we're always changing in this life, and nothing stays on the same way. The same thing with relationships. People, they get married and they think that every day in the marriage life should be a bliss, something that is so much enjoyable and so on. Who said that life is all about this? Some day there is sadness, some days there is happiness and so on. Even the Prophet ﷺ, and it's mentioned in the Quran, he went through difficulties. So to understand the reality of life, but to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ahkamul hakimin. He's the most just. He created things in this life like this for a reason, for us to be patient, for us to be grateful, for us to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of these different situations and different circumstances, to see who among us are truthful and who are just basically following their own desires. There are great meanings, many things that really can be mentioned. And when it comes to the subject of the names and attributes of Allah, we can go on forever talking about it, because this entire life is a manifestation of these attributes and these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the proper understanding, to make us see the reality of things, for us to be patient, and to have good expectations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way He ordered us, following the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So till next time with another episode of the Gems of the Heart, I leave you with the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.